Welcome to our Bible study of the letters of St. Paul. Today I'd like to present an introduction to the letter to the Galatians. St. Paul's letter to the Galatians is the first letter written by Paul that has been preserved to the present day. The letter was written most likely to the Christian believers in the southern part of the Roman province of Galatia, that Paul visited on his first missionary journey in the years 47-48 AD. We can read about that in Acts chapter 13, verse 13 to chapter 14, verse 23. Let's take a look at where these churches were on the map. Right here, we're talking about Asia Minor, or what today is modern Turkey. When St. Paul left for his first missionary journey, he left from Antioch of Syria. Of course, Israel is down here in Judea. He was accompanied by Barnabas. And they first went to the Isle of Cyprus, then up here to southern part of Galatia. Cities established churches in Perga, Antioch of Pisidia, not to be confused with Antioch of Syria, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And then they went back to those churches on their return back to Antioch of Syria. That the letter is written to the churches in the south of Galatia. Makes the most sense as Paul's travels normally focused on large cities along the Mediterranean coast, connected to the major Roman roads. Because of that, we'll assume that the letter wasn't written to northern Gaul, where the ethnic Gauls or Celts had settled in towns like Pessinus and Ankara. From where and when did Paul write the letter? The letter, like all of Paul's letters, was written in Greek, the medium of communication in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Where it was written from and when it was written are disputed. It was probably written from Syrian Antioch in around 48-49 AD. This would be before the Jerusalem Council, which was held a little later, around 49-50 AD, and we'll speak about that a little later. Now, why did Paul write the letter? Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians after learning that certain agitators or intruders had gained a foothold in these churches, urging the male Gentile or non-Jewish believers to be circumcised. Paul insists that you do not have to become physically Jewish in order to belong to the Messiah's family. The Deuteronomy curses, which we find in chapters 26-28, for disobeying the law of Moses. Those curses have been borne by Jesus on the cross. And as a result, Jews and Gentiles were justified before God and received adoption into the covenant family of Abraham. If one is in the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, then one is in Abraham's family. Faith and the gift of the Holy Spirit are signs of belonging to God's people. Paul tells the Galatians, if righteousness or justification before God could be gained by means of observing the Jewish law or the Torah, then Jesus the Messiah died for nothing. Earlier, Paul had won a victory for the principle of male Gentiles not needing to be circumcised. This agreement occurred at a Jerusalem meeting with the pillar apostles, Peter and John, along with James, the brother of the Lord. But this agreement was short-lived when people arrived in Syrian Antioch from James in Jerusalem. And while there, Peter and Barnabas withdrew from table fellowship with Gentiles. Paul saw this as hypocrisy. Peter had earlier been happy to eat with Gentile believers, but now was taking a different stand. Paul opposed Peter in person. But shortly afterwards, news reaches Paul that the group of Jewish Christian missionaries, intruders or agitators, more likely from Syrian Antioch, perhaps one individual in particular, had been trying to persuade the male Gentile believers in Galatian churches to be circumcised. Now, what was the situation? Pisidian Antioch was a kind of new Rome. Civic life evolved around religious observances. Everyone would be expected to show up at pagan and emperor worship services, except for the Jews, who had official permission to pray for Rome, but not to them. But now suddenly a new group, the Gentile converts to Christianity, were staying away from the normal pagan and emperor worship ceremonies conducted in the city's temples. Members of this new group would claim they were entitled to the Jewish exception. In other words, Jews did not have to attend the pagan or worship of the emperor. And now these Gentile were asking for the same exemption. Members of this new group would claim that they were entitled to the Jewish exception, since being followers of Israel's Messiah, they were children of Abraham also. Before the coming of Christ, the rite of circumcision was the doorway into God's covenant agreement with Abraham and the rite of initiation into the family of Israel. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his resurrection, however, marks a turning point in covenant history, where circumcision is now set aside, along with the entire body of liturgical and ceremonial legislation, including the sacrifice of animals, and the dietary rules promulgated by Moses. Through his cross and resurrection, Christ has redeemed us from the curses of the old covenant, as I mentioned earlier, and unleashed the divine blessings of the new covenant in a powerful way that he announced at the Last Supper, inaugurating a new creation here on earth and a renewed Israel. The new covenant ratified by Christ fulfills the covenant made with Abraham, that he and his descendants would be a blessing for all the nations. God told Abraham, we read about in Genesis 22:18, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Now, whoever receives baptism and embraces Christ in faith becomes a spiritual descendant of Abraham and an adopted child of God. These Gentile Christian converts were in a risky situation. By failing to worship the gods, including the emperor, they could be arrested as well as be blamed for any disasters that might strike. That's the way the pagans thought. It is highly likely that the intruders wanted the Galatian Gentile converts to undergo male circumcision in order to resolve their ambiguous status as neither being pagans anymore nor being physically Jews. Nevertheless, Paul was horrified and angry, both at the rival teachers and at church members. So he immediately sent a letter to them, urging them not to be circumcised. Well, next time we'll begin our study of the verses, chapters and verses of the letter to Galatians. And thank you for joining me today, and God bless you.